Hi, welcome back to the shop. I just got in this 40 scrub plane by Stanley. I sold one just a month or so ago that was similar to it, and I kind of regretted it afterwards. But so I've replaced it, and I have two to talk to you about today. The first thing I want to get into is what an actual scrub plane is, because these two are scrub planes by Stanley. And I'm going to give you an example of how they work, but let's talk about them first. They're distinctively different than most of the Bailey style planes that we're used to by Stanley. And there are a lot of people that actually convert some of the Bailey ones over to what they call, quote, a scrub plane. And that's very easily done. It damages the plane because you have to modify the sole to open up the mouth. But I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a moment. And we'll delve a little deeper into these two scrub planes that we have here. So first, let me say that the 40.5 is basically the same plane as the 40, except that you can see it's a little bit longer and it's a hair bit wider, maybe 1/4 of an inch. But we'll set this down and away for a moment, and we'll talk about the number 40. The number 40 is the first one that they came out with in 1896. And it ran until 1962. The 40.5, the larger one, that was started in 1902, so about 6 years after the smaller one, and it only ran until 1947. They stopped production after the war, so that's kind of interesting. The planes changed. Originally, they had a more decorative cap here. They did have this early iron, which I'll show you a close-up of, which is a 2-line iron. Symbol Stanley here, and this one here is a Sweetheart Stanley logo on this one. I'll show you that as well. Handles on them changed over the years. The first one in 1896 up until 1942 was made out of beech. And then in 1942 they switched over to hardwood. They don't specify what that is, but it was of some sort of hardwood. And then that went through 1949. So these were never made after that in rosewood, but these, the smaller one, was made with rosewood handles all the way up until 1962. So from 1950 to 62, these were rosewood. So if you're trying to date these, you can do most of it by either the logo on the iron, the cap screw, or the type of wood there is. So let's talk a little bit about the function of this tool. So we're probably mostly familiar with these Bailey style planes. They have an adjuster for the depth of the cutter. The cutter has a chip breaker attached to it. It's a 2-piece cutter. And this has a cam lever cap on it. And the mouth on it, in particular, is generally extremely tight. So a fine shaving can get through the blade and the sole of the plane. These were finishing planes. These were smoothing, and they were meant to finish your work after you use something like this. In order to use these as a scrub plane, people will cut open the opening of the mouth and curve the bottom of the iron, and thereby kind of spoon out the cut that it would make, and it would have to allow a thick shaving. Why that's important is because these planes were designed, scrub planes were designed to work on rough timber that hasn't already been smoothed, and it's meant to take large, thick shavings. The iron on a Bailey style plane, on a typical Stanley, is thinner than this one. This 40 and the 40.5, the irons are much more stable, and they don't require a chip breaker. So they are a single iron plane, and they don't have a lever cap. They have a little piece in here, and they have a crossbar that goes through, and this sits down on that crossbar at that, like that. And if you can see it, but here's the little bridge, and this has two little spots for it to sit in, and then you tighten it up, and that applies the pressure against the blade down here to act as a chip breaker and allow the chip to come out and curl away, and it helps to hold this in place without it moving around. So that's the basic construction. The other differences in these planes is your front tote, your front knob, is much higher than the older Baileys. Not so with the newer Baileys, but you see it's got this little shape down here, and so it's got a nice little support for your thumb down there, and then this sort of I don't know what kind of shape to call that, but that's only on these 40 planes did they do this front knob like that. There's no lateral adjustment on this. This plane iron needs to be adjusted the way some of the older ones were, and you can either use a little light hammer to move them over slightly, but what I do is I do it by eyeing it and then sighting down the plane so that my scoop is even. Now, let me show you basically how these are so much better than a typical smoothing plane for roughing down this large log here. You can see that this will take little shavings. I'm starting off with a high point. Here's another high point that needs to come down. But see, the shavings are very fine, and it'll take me a long time to get this level down to where I need to. And that's mostly because that throat can't take a thick shaving. What we really want to do is gouge this stuff off. And that's how these function so much better. Now, let me bring it in close so you can see the shape of these irons to the throat and show you what they look like here. Here's a closer view, and you see how curved the iron is, almost like a spoon, and how much space is in here for shaving to go through. And then if you sight down the iron, you can see how deep that iron is extending past the sole of the plane, and that really allows for a thick shaving. So let's take it over to this log and see what this does. So this cherry log has been air drying for a couple of years. It's pretty dry, but as you can see, it's still pretty rough, and I had a little struggling trying to get a good way to hold onto it. But here you can see the shavings that are coming off on this, and how I can hit these high spots very quickly to knock them down, and I can continue all the way across. Now that did not take very long, and I've got a fairly flat surface. Still, I have all this stuff in here to rough out, but you can see all of those high spots are now at the same level. So can continue going at it. And in this case, I'm cutting on an angle to the board, mostly because I'm using these flat spots as a reference. And it reduces tear out. If I do it in this direction, I might get a little bit of tear out. Right now it doesn't matter because we're just trying to get this flat. So you can see how quickly the scrub plane will take these thick shavings off and get you almost down to a smoothing surface. I'm going to go to the 40, which is the smaller one, and show you how that one works as well. They're not that different, but they so this is that smaller one, and you can see when I go in a straight line, there's a little curvature right here. That's the shape of the of this tool, of this iron. Now, some people use these to decorate beams and things to give it a hewn look, but we're trying to get this down to where we can get a flat smoothing plane on it to work on it. So we'll keep taking away. Pretty flat. Not smooth yet. Now I'm going across the grain, knocking off those high spots, and come back soon with a smoothing plane to surface it. So here I've switched out to a rough sawn board rather than just a log. So this is how you would get it from the lumber yard. You can see these are all the bandsaw marks. And so what I've done now is I've taken this and I've drawn the blade back so that it's not too deep a cut, because I really just want to get this roughness off. And you can see how quickly it takes off all those little high spots and exposes what's underneath. And that's because basically that iron is like a spoon, and I'm scorping it out. I'm scooping it out. So the cut is heavier than a smoothing plane would be. But I'm not taking it too deep. But you can see here's some of the saw marks. So this area here was much higher, and it needs to be taken down some more before you can hit this with a smoothing plane. So do it that way. Let's go back across those. Now the board's getting nice and flat, and I can come back with either a smoothing plane. It's very flat. So there's still some spots that are high, but you can see it really is a lot like scrubbing the wood, but how quickly it does it is the benefit, because if I was trying to do this with a smoothing plane, I could be here a long time. Here's the smoothing plane on it. See, because I've gotten off those uneven spots, the smoothing plane is really doing a nice job of just hitting the certain areas on the grain that we want. And we really want the smoothing plane to do a thin finish cut, so it exposes see how flat that is, and that's because I took the 40 first and knocked off all that unevenness. Now I can go through and smooth it out to however I want with a smoother. But that's where that 40 and the 40.5 come in handy, is just getting it ready for that other tool to hit. It's nice and flat now, that whole portion. So there you have it, the 40 scrub plane and the 40.5 scrub plane. I think they both work equally well. If you've got a really big slab that you need to do some flattening on, then you would probably get the larger one. See how thick and big the chips are? and that's because of that open throat. They're nicely designed planes. The only issue I have with them is that you really have to tighten these down. Otherwise, they want to slip around. What I did was I put a little sandpaper to the iron there so that it has a little bit of a grip to it. But other than that, they're great little planes, and they save you a lot of time because you can scrub that down to a partially smooth surface, then come back and hit it with a smoother. So I hope you've gotten a little bit out of the video. I'm glad you came, and I'm glad to add this back into my collection and get ready to use it. It worked beautifully on this redwood burl, and it worked great on the cherry. So it really, a softer wood or harder wood doesn't matter. It really depends on how sharp you make that iron, and that you don't put it out too far, that you're taking a chunk that the grain won't allow, because if you go a little too deep, it'll split off and it'll jam in the plane. But great planes. Thanks for coming to the shop, and you all take care of yourselves until I see you again.